I mean, this is not a matter of whether God decrees it or not. It's a question of how did this good man make an evil decision. And if I were an Arminian, I'd have the same quandary. I just don't know how a good man can make an evil decision. I know it was irrational on his part. And it may be that by looking for a rational explanation for an irrational event, that I'm committed to defeat in advance. But I just don't know. I don't know how a good man could make an evil decision. I know that a neutral man couldn't have made any decision. I mean, if Adam didn't have any character at all, he wouldn't have done anything. And so there doesn't seem to... And to say that he was evil, created evil, is obviously to say that God doesn't make good creatures. He didn't make all things good. And so all evangelicals are faced with that. That's a real mystery.
Yet it's not unique, because in the second Adam we have the same phenomenon in Christ. It is my understanding of the New Testament, Jesus could have sinned if he wanted to, but he did not. He also was under probation. So the first and the second Adam share this idea, this mystery, that given the motivation they could have sinned, but whence did the motivation come?
Well, but there is this difference in that Jesus did what was good and had a good character. And so he did according to his character. Adam had a good character but did what was evil, did contrary to his character. And that's what I think raises the difficulty. In Christ's case, there is no contra-character behavior. In Adam, there is.
But I was focusing on motivation. If Satan were to be successful and to turn that probation into a temptation, as he did, and Christ not yield, he had to appeal to an evil motive in a good man. And Satan did the same thing for the first Adam. He appealed to an evil motive in a good man, which wasn't there, yet the results came about. So the mystery, it seems to me, metaphysically is the same.
In that sense, I understand what you're getting at. How could Satan have hoped to accomplish anything?
Yeah.
Of
My
course,
answer is Satan, Christ could have fallen. So could have Adam.
Oh,
A
sure.
perfect man may fall.
Oh, yeah. If you hold to the Communicatio Idiomatum, am I making sense to everybody? You know, the Lutheran Calvinist, it's probably the biggest controversy between Lutherans and Calvinists in the history of the church, and accounts for the rest of them, for the rest of the differences, I believe. But the Communicatio Idiomatum, the Lutheran doctrine is, so you have the divine nature and the human nature. And the Lutheran view of the communication of attributes, Communicatio Idiomatum in Latin, is that what is true of the divine nature can be attributed to the human. What is true of the human can be attributed to the divine. The Calvinist doctrine is that what's true of the divine and human natures can both be attributed to the person of Christ. Okay, so the Lutheran says, for instance, that if Christ has a human body and God is omnipresent, that necessarily the human body of Jesus is omnipresent because he's God in man. There's a communication of attributes, and the communication is between the natures. What is true of the human nature is true of the divine. So if the divine nature is omnipresent, then the physical human nature is omnipresent, which explains, of course, the difference between Calvinists and Lutherans in the Lord's Supper. The Lutheran believes the body of Christ is what? With, under, and in the element. The Calvinist says, no, it's not. Christ is present only by his Spirit. The element is only a corporeal sign. So the Lutheran believes that Christ's body is omnipresent, whereas the Calvinist says that what is true of the divine can be said of the person of Christ, what is true of the human can be said of the person of Christ. Okay, so we would say that Christ in his person is omnipresent, and Christ in his person has a physical body. But we don't say the physical body is omnipresent. Now this comes to a real head when you get to the Patripassian controversy in the Christian church. How could God die? I mean, did God die upon the cross? Okay, good Lutheran answer. Yes, God died upon the cross. Calvinist says Jesus Christ died upon the cross. He died with respect to his human nature. The divine nature couldn't have died. Consequently, it was the person of Jesus Christ that went to the cross, and he died with respect to his human nature, but he didn't die in his divine nature. The idea that the one in whom life is to be found died is contradictory. Okay, so you had these two different approaches to Christology. And with respect to the temptation of Christ, not all Calvinists have lived up to their own version of the communicatio idiomatum. But you have to say, could Christ have sinned? And the answer is yes and no. With respect to his divine nature, no. With respect to his human nature, yes. And then there will be people who will say, but since the divine nature takes precedent over the human nature, then the answer, and we're all said and done, is no. As I recall, Hodge does that in the systematic theology. But that isn't fair. I mean, Calvinists have always said the answer is yes and no. Is Christ omnipresent? How do you answer that? Is Christ right now omnipresent?
Yes and no.
The answer is yes and no. I certainly believe Christ is with us in this classroom, but I think that his body is somewhere in heaven, the right hand of God. And so, anyway, I think the Calvinist approach to the communication of attributes, they're communicated to the person rather than to each other. And so I agree with you. Christ could have sinned.
Has there ever been a theological debate in question 2, the aspect of previous knowledge in Christ concerning heaven, its glories, his presence there, as absent in Adam, who only knew of an earthly existence, no heavenly type of existence outside of maybe his walk and talk with God?
Yeah.
Has anyone ever taken up that controversy, and in that sense...
well, there is a controversy over what Jesus did know. I mean, Jesus claims not to know the day of his second coming. He says only the Father in heaven knows that. Well, I mean, I want to stick close to the text, and I want to, be fair to that, but there is a sense in which Jesus knows the day of his second coming too. With respect to his divine nature, he knows everything. He's omniscient. Okay? There's a real mystery in the incarnation, isn't there?
But I mean,
He's ignorant, and yet he's all-knowing. He's ignorant like a human being. No human being knows the day of the second coming. Either does he. He says only the Father in heaven knows that. And yet I am the Father are one. And so he knows it too. What do you think about Jesus praying in the garden, about this cup passing from him? Well, Jesus knew very well the cup was not going to pass from him. In terms of his divine nature, he knew the outcome of the story. And yet, as a human being, he could pray, and legitimately pray, if it be your will, Father, have it pass.
So then you're saying there is the division again of the divine and the human, in the sense of the divine aspect.
We don't want to say division. We want to say distinction.
Distinction. That within the divinity, within him, yes, there is that aspect of previous knowledge, but within the humanity of Christ, that did not enter into...
Right. With respect to his humanity, no. With respect to his deity, yes. But we don't want, the Chalcedonian formula says there is no confusion, division, mixture, or separations between the two natures. A lot of philosophical problems are going to be, I think, played out on the whole area of Christology over the next few years. I'm not a prophet, so don't, nail me down if I'm wrong on this. But my guess is, you pick up this book, Brody's put together articles, and not from an evangelical motivation as far as I can see. He's put together all these articles dealing with our these are the things we've been debating for centuries as Christians. Maybe not with all the logical precision we should. But nevertheless, these are really old problems to us. And my guess is some of these same things will, from a philosophical standpoint, begin to arise with the Christological questions, too. Did you ever? Okay. Go ahead, Terry.
Back on my question, one added thing. The mystery part with Adam, why did have motivations? Could that also be applied to Satan or Lucifer himself?
Yes, I was going on to say that. We've been covering a lot of things. I was going to say, in one sense, we have to ask, how could a good angel have fallen? And the only hint we have to that, and it's barely that, is at one point in the New Testament where the qualifications for church office are given. An overseer is not to be a novice, lest he be puffed up and fall into the snare of Satan. And the implication seems to be that this is the very thing that led Satan to his fall, was thinking too highly of himself, if you will. Pride is at the heart of it. And of course, he's a liar from the beginning. Seems to be a reference to lying to men from the beginning. I don't think Satan's fall was based on a lie, but somehow an overweening pride. Again, not recognizing one's place before God. I suppose we can go one step further and say that God made Satan as well as Adam free to do contrary to his desires. There may very well be a misconception of one's freedom in the person of Adam and Satan, where the freedom to do contrary to God's desires might be taken as the metaphysical ability to become God himself. To actually, if you will, play upon the backdrop of history independently of God. And that is to conceive of one's freedom as something more than it really is. And there's Satan's pride, okay? I can disobey God. I have the freedom to disobey God. I can actually become a God myself. It's interesting, that's what Satan tempts man with, right? And you will become as God. Perhaps that's what Satan thought he was doing too. A misconception of the nature of his freedom. Now, that's only a hint, because then the natural question is what? How could an unfallen creature have such a misconception? How could he have fallen into such a mistaken way of thinking about himself, which led to pride, and in Adam's case, to disobedience? Well, the origin of evil in a good man, I don't know. I do know that he had the freedom to do that. Where he got the motivation to do it, I'm not sure.
And I think we can safely say that superior knowledge, whether it be Adamic in the sense of having perfection in that sense, or angelic in the sense of Lucifer, does not guarantee perfectly doing the will of God.
Well, you can go two ways on that. You could say that a person who disobeys God's will doesn't really have that superior knowledge.
I don't think I follow that.
Okay, let's say I'm speaking to a Christian brother and I say, do you know what it means to control your anger or lust in terms of Spirit-given attitudes? He says, yeah, I know what that means. I said, I don't mean, do you know how to answer questions on a ethics exam, how to fill in the blanks? You know, we walk by the Spirit rather than by the flesh, so forth and so on. I mean, do you know what that means? And the guy says, well, yeah, I do, but then you see the next day you find that he's, showing this anger or demonstrating this lust. And you would want to say you know, but as a matter of fact, without the ability to do it or without actually doing it, one doesn't know. That is, there is a broader sense to knowledge in the Bible whereby those who are disobeying God don't truly know his will. Of course, there's also a sense in which those who disobey know what they're supposed to do and don't do it. That's the agony of Romans 7, right? That which I would do, I don't do, and vice versa. So I think it really is going to depend on what you're getting at when you say knowledge, superior knowledge.
Well, I was thinking in terms of Adam, in terms of Satan. Certainly there is a superior knowledge unto man in those two respects. Us as fallen creatures and such, who fall short of God's glory. And realizing that they, in the very presence of God, who had fellowship, communion with God, obviously, sharing in Satan's sense the glories that God himself had in his presence. that did not guarantee that they could continue in a sinless state, that they could perfectly, in a sense, obey God's commands. Superior knowledge.
Oh no, well, you know the answer to that question. However you categorize the knowledge, nothing guaranteed that Adam would not fall.
So we can't say, well, that's sort of...
There may be a sense. Let me try this out. It may be heretical. Throw it out if it doesn't wash when you look at the Bible. But isn't there a sense in which the man who learns to control his anger by the power of God's Spirit, a redeemed, regenerate man who is being sanctified, knows God in a superior way to what Adam knew even before he fell? Isn't there something more God-glorifying and closer to God in obedience than in what Adam experienced? I don't know. I'm proposing that as a possible value scheme. And that may come close to explaining why God allowed the fall, because what we will know as redeemed, confirmed righteous creatures is even more glorious than what we would have known as confirmed righteous creatures who had never known the redemptive love of God. There's something superior in that. Sir?
Is that not utilitarian?
God's utilitarian, isn't he?
Okay.
Doesn't he do what's best for the most people? God's such a great utilitarian that he never has to sacrifice anybody's well-being for it.
Yeah, I agree. However, it seems some of the arguments of evil, or explanations of evil that we rejected, rely on this definition, however, not from a Christian view necessarily.
In the sense
God
that
allowed the fall to allow greater good.
Mhm. He maximizes good this way, and therefore if we take away evil, we're taking away good. Well, now, of course, that doesn't follow on the Christian conception of maximizing good, because what we say is God is making the best of a bad situation. And therefore, he wants us to take away the bad situation, too, and that's precisely part of the good that's involved. But no, we're not saying that God is simply doing something because the end justifies the means. But we are saying, however, that there is going to be a more glorious end in his plan. Yeah.
Could you go again over Pelham's response to Pike when Pike says that really you have no way of showing that there is no morally sufficient grounds or reason for existence of evil?
Yeah, Penelum says that within a particular theistic system you do have a way of doing that, because within a particular conception of theism you have a moral code. And to say that man is good is to say he keeps this moral code. To say that God is good is to say that he's like man in that respect. And therefore this moral code may be used to evaluate the available rationales that God may have had for allowing evil. And if it turns out that the kind of evil you're looking at, say the suffering of a child or a cancer patient or something like that, that none of these available rationales, given the moral system, given the ethical views of this theistic system, will justify God, that there may be a way of saying that God has no morally sufficient reason. Given Christian ethics, maybe God doesn't have a morally sufficient reason, because whatever reason he would have to be like a morally sufficient reason for a man. And the system does dictate a limit to what those morally sufficient reasons are for a man. And so you have to carry it out. Now, in Brody's introduction, he says it might be a challenge to the student to try to carry out Penelum's criticism on just one particular instance. Just try to carry it out. Okay, what are the morally sufficient reasons that Christianity lays down for men to do things of this nature? And then try applying them to God in some particular instance. Although he doesn't say what the conclusion is, he suggests that it really can't be done. That Penelum has claimed in theory there's a limit to what rationales might be invoked, but that in practice you never know which one to invoke, and that there's always different interpretations of the evil, and so you really couldn't carry out the criticism. Go ahead, Terry.
How does moral evil influence physical evil if it does? Is there any fluidity between them?
Is there any fluidity between the two?
Yeah.
Explain your metaphor to me.
Is there any connection? Result, cause,
Conceptual? Causal?
cause, result.
Yes, I think there's some causal result. I don't think that Mount St. Helens would have erupted if man hadn't fallen into sin. I don't believe that God would have flooded the world if men hadn't been sinful in excess. So yeah, there's some connection between the moral realm and the physical realm in that way. Now the question is there a one-to-one, or is there some formula so that you can say so much evil produces this kind of physical effect? There also seems to be some, well, not seems to be some, but certainly in all ways, God is in control of what's happening in the physical cosmos about us. We can say that had it not been for the sinfulness of man, there wouldn't have been these natural disasters. But that isn't to say that God has a formula, or at least one discernible to human beings, whereby natural disasters come under certain circumstances of evil. So is there relevance? Yes. Is there a causal connection in a formalized way? I don't believe so. I don't think the Bible gives us any reason to think so. I certainly do not believe that all the physical evil in the world comes from Satan. That was cute of Flanagan to pull that in his article, but as a matter of fact, that isn't biblical. God does send some of these things himself. Is there fluidity between them then? I don't know. I'm not even sure it's a good idea to call physical evil evil. I tend to think of the problem of pain and the problem of evil. Okay? Now, I'm just giving you my own personal insight. If I talk to people and they want to talk about pain, why are there painful things in the world? Earthquakes, tidal waves, that sort of thing. Then we can talk about why God does this sort of thing. Or we can talk about evil. Why is it that men do wicked, nasty things to each other? Why are there wars? Why is there cheating? Why is this, that, and the other happen? I think they are different problems. Yes.
When you say that God does send evil, or whatever the word is used, then you're also using with that the same kind of mystery with free will that we talked about earlier, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea, just as we talked about, not necessarily that it comes directly from.
When we're talking about moral evil, yes. Okay, let's say that, let's just presume, kind of like a wild guess, that our country is suffering for its sins right now in the socio-political economic arena. Nobody ever would have thought that sort of thing, so it's obviously a wild guess. Let's say that's happening. God is punishing our waywardness with our waywardness. Our wickedness is becoming its own punishment in one sense. Okay, I think that the wicked things that are happening in our country today, let's say in the law courts, in terms of racial tension or what have you, these things are being done by men freely choosing to do them. And nevertheless, they're doing it according to the decree of God. God is decreeing these things to happen, but he's decreeing that men freely engage in them. They do so because they want to do so. And so the people who were involved in the riots in Miami this last week were doing according to their own pleasure, but they're also doing God's pleasure in the sense that God decreed it. They're doing according to the decree of God, and yet freely choosing to do so. But now physical evil, and that's why I was suggesting to Terry a second ago, it's not quite the same thing, because there's really no choice of man involved there in any direct causal sense. And consequently, I don't think the problem of free will enters there. I think we simply have to say that God, in his sovereignty, in his moral excellence and transcendence, has the right to send earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and all the rest. So those are different questions depending on whether you're dealing with physical or moral evil. The evil about us does involve the free will of man. No man is coerced to do evil. I mean, after all, God doesn't even tempt men to do evil, much less coerce them to do it, according to the Bible. Well, we've taken little bit more time than I thought on the problem of evil, but we're getting used to going a little over time. I'd like to talk about philosophical anthropology. We're going to clear the register now. Do we need to take a 5-minute break so you can all be thinking on a new subject? Okay. Psalm 8. What is man, that thou art mindful of him? The Bible answers, the psalmist answers, that man is created temporarily lower than the angels. That's what man is, created for the time being lower than the angels. Alexander Pope said that man was the glory, jest, and riddle of the world. Karl Marx said that the real nature of man is the totality of social relations. Jean-Paul Sartre says man is condemned to be free, that man is the whole in being, which is his way of explaining man's freedom. Well, what is man? Philosophical anthropology is of immense practical importance as well as being quite philosophically engaging today. We have a number of philosophical problems about the nature of man, the problems of man, as well as the cure for man's problems, and these, of course, have immense practical importance. For instance, how you analyze man himself and his nature is going to determine what you think man ought to do and what man can do and how man can do it when it comes to a cure for his problems. Christianity says that man must call upon God for help. Marxism says we must transform society because society makes men what they are. Existentialism says men must become fully aware of their freedom if they're going to be cured of their problems. And the nature of man, the nature of man's problem, and the cure of man's problems are all going to affect the views that are held in terms of political, economic, educational practices, just to mention a few. If you do any study of educational theory today, you'll find out that educational theory is completely dependent upon what theory of man is being assumed by the educational theorist. That's also true in economics. There are some people whose economic theory is built upon the idea that men are naturally greedy, and the only way to restrain the greed of men is to put them in a free market situation where greed will control greed. There are other views that say that men are naturally good and benevolent, and consequently the government can tax us for the sake of welfare programs, and that we'll have no difficulty with that. There are some educational and social theories that say that if we but put black and white young people in the same classroom, even though their parents are against the whole idea, that naturally, because of that environmental change, they will grow up having better racial views. Okay, you see how educational, social, economic, political views are dependent upon what somebody thinks of man, of man's nature, his problem, and the correction of his problems. Modern philosophy and modern psychology, sociology, economics, biology, and we could go on, virtually all the departments of the university foster diverse theories of human nature. When I was a graduate student, it was sometimes amusing to me to speak with undergraduates who would go from one area of the university, say the philosophy department, to another area of the university, the sociology department, and then to another area of the university, the psychology department, and get radically contradictory theories of man, and yet not even know that they're being, given all these different theories. As far as they know, they can just put all these things together, some kind of motley collection, a patchwork view of man. Of course, it just won't work. What are we to think of man? Philosophical anthropology raises basic questions of metaphysics. For instance, is man free? Basic questions of epistemology. How do we know that this theory or that theory is correct about man? What evidence do we use? Questions of ethics. What should man do? Okay, now our author, Leslie Stevenson, tells us that we would do well to distinguish between a theory, an ideology, and a closed system. Somebody tell me what's the difference between a theory and an ideology? Anybody?
Theory is something that is proponed, hypothesis, not necessarily taken as commitment to or carried out in action or fully believed upon.
Okay, let's put it this way. What's the difference between holding a theory and holding an ideology, where a theory is something that's believed?
Well, doesn't the ideology entail a deep faith commitment to that view, whereas the theory might not necessarily entail it?
That's one way you can put it, but you have to explain what you mean by, quote, a deep faith commitment.
No.
In the first place, a theory involves perhaps just a particular view. And so you believe in economic determinism. That's a theory of economic determinism. But economic determinism doesn't become an ideology until that theory becomes systematic, incorporated into a way of life for a community of believers. Okay, so Marxism is an ideology because there's a community, okay, the Marxist Party, let's say, a community that has systematic views. That is, they don't have simply a particular view, but that particular view integrated into a system of thought about man. And the best way I can put it is, it's a way of life. It involves a certain way of responding to intellectual problems, a way of acting in the world, a certain game plan, certain values held in common. It's an entire way of life. And so deep faith in that sense, that it involves the whole of man, integrating views systematically, put into a practical context of a way of life, and held by a community. Okay, what's the difference between an ideology and a closed system, according to Stevenson? Okay, a theory becomes an ideology when you add these things to it. When does an ideology become a closed system? Anybody?
Yeah, I can't get into the whole thing of verificationism and the anatomy of Schlu's discussion.
Yes, that's good. I'm going to bring that up in just a second. What is it that makes something closed? It's the way it's defended.
When it's beyond verification or falsification.
Defended by having no conceivable falsification. Okay? So all counter evidence is explained away, all counter evidence, because there's no conceivable grounds for disputing with the theory, and it's defended not only by having no conceivable falsification, but by impugning the motives of the critic. Okay, so a Marxist, or Marxism, is a closed system of ideology, because any conceivable evidence brought against Marxism has built right into the system an explanation for it. You can always explain away any counter evidence to Marxism. And anybody who is criticizing Marxism is impugned as being what? Sold out to a particular economic class, or duped by the particular stage in the historical dialectic in which one is bound. It almost amounts to saying anybody who criticizes it couldn't understand it. Because if you understood it, you'd never criticize it. Okay, so that's a closed system of ideology. And our author says that impugning somebody's motivation is really philosophically irrelevant. And I think his words are very well taken. He says, if we are primarily concerned with the truth or falsity of what is said, and with whether there are any good reasons for believing it, then motivation is irrelevant. Okay, let us assume that the man has a bad motivation. We still have to deal with the content of what he brings up critically, don't we? The fact that his motivation is poor doesn't mean that his criticism is false. Okay, you all follow that motivation is irrelevant. To use motivation, to impugn the motivation of a critic as a way of dealing with his criticism is basically irrational. Okay, so I want to give him this. But now how about this? A closed system is something defended by having no conceivable falsification. This is where our flu discussion comes in. You remember how we went over that? And Flew gives the impression, as he looks at non-falsifiable theories, that anything that's held in a non-falsifiable attitude is meaningless. What was the difficulty with saying that?
Well, we all, by nature, have pre-theoretical prejudices, and they, by definition, are unfalsifiable.
We all have basic presuppositions.
Right.
Okay, so it turns out to say that these are meaningless because they're the things you hold most tenaciously is an odd way of reasoning, isn't it? The thing that is most meaningful to a person becomes meaningless just because it is most meaningful. That is, he holds it more tenaciously than anything else. That's his fundamental commitment. Remember we talked about the mammon worshiper. Here's this materialist, right? Okay, the thing that is most important to him, the highest value, is money. Well, what could challenge that commitment? Well, in one sense, nothing could challenge that commitment. If anything challenged his ultimate commitment to money, money would not be his ultimate commitment. You see, by making it his ultimate commitment, it must be the judge of everything else. And so it turns out that everybody holds to some kind of presupposition that is it's inconceivable to falsify it. Everybody holds to some ultimate concern. Everybody has some religious conviction, even if it's irreligious. And even if it's his atheism that he is most committed to. And so our author says, well, at one point he says, why do people have this kind of tenacity with respect to their anthropological theories or ideologies? On page 12, he says, why should people maintain a belief in the face of difficulties? Why is it that when these problems, like the problem of evil, he uses that as his illustration. I thought it was very timely, our reading. If you did it this week, after all, we've read Flu, we've read the problem of evil. So all this stuff is old hat to you, right? I mean, you're able to handle all this now. And he looks at it and he said, here the Christians have this problem of evil, and they're always rationalizing it away. Okay? I'm trusting that by God's grace, something's been accomplished in this class, and you can better handle that when an atheistic writer starts saying these things now. But he says, why should people maintain a belief in the face of difficulties? Marxists, Christians, Platonists, Sartreans, Skinnerians, Freudians, what have you. Why should people maintain their beliefs when there are difficulties with them? Well, inertia. What's inertia?
The opposite of momentum.
That's right. It's what it's sometimes hard to have when it comes time to get to this class. Inertia, right? Oh, you got to get up and go to class. If you just can't get yourself to do it. You haven't got the inertia. Okay? Why should people maintain beliefs? Inertia. People don't like changing their minds. I mean, I have children at home that don't like changing their clothes. I have plenty of adult friends who don't like changing their minds. It's just too much work. Inertia. Unwillingness to admit that one is wrong. Okay, there's a personal pride matter that enters in too. Okay, inertia and unwillingness to admit that one is wrong must play some part here. If one has been brought up in a certain belief and way of life, or if one has been converted to it and then followed it, it takes courage to abandon one's past. When a belief is an ideology giving rise to the way of life of a social group, it will always be difficult for the members of the group to consider it objectively. If you ever want to convince a group of Baptists that it is biblically legitimate to baptize infants, you will always do much better to talk to the Baptists one-on-one than to go to the American Baptist Convention and try to get the group to listen to you. You see, there's this inherent, if you will, conservatism, stick-to-itness, tenacity of the ideological group. By the way, that's true also of Presbyterians. I just happened to put the shoe on that foot. You probably wouldn't do well if you went to the OPC-GA and tried to convince them that you shouldn't baptize infants. But you might get one individual Presbyterian to consider your arguments. Okay, he says it's difficult for the members of the group to consider it objectively. There will be strong social pressures to continue to acknowledge the belief. And it will be natural for believers to maintain it as a closed system. People will feel that their belief, even if open to objections, contains some vital insight, some vision of essential truth. To abandon it may be to abandon what gives meaning, purpose, and hope to one's life. Now, what I'm trying to point out is that what he says he wants to distinguish between theories of man that are closed ideologies, closed system ideologies, and those which are not. I don't believe there is such a distinction. I believe they're all closed. Now, there are some people who may be floundering. There may be some people who are wavering. There may be some people who are not sure what to think anymore. But in the nature of the case, a Marxist or a Freudian or a Skinnerian or a Christian, they all hold closed systems of belief with respect to man. For to question their views of man is to question something which is systematically basic to their philosophy. The nature of man, the nature of his problem, the nature of his solution. Those are systematically basic issues in philosophy of man. The author gets into a discussion. He says, what kind of statement is being used in anthropological systems? What kind of statement do we find? Now, he breaks statements down into the following classes. He has one group of factual, sometimes he calls them synthetic, and then finally on page 16, he labels this empirical statements. Okay, so there's one group. If I say there are 16 cars in the parking lot, that's an empirical statement. It's the sort of thing you can go out and objectively check against your senses, the evidence of your senses. And then he says there's also analytic statements, if you will, things that are true by definition. Okay, all bachelors are unmarried men. All the research in the world will not disconfirm that theory because it's true by definition. And then there are valuational statements, matters of evaluation, if you will, putting some kind of ethical grading or categorization on something. Okay, so he says here are these three different kinds of statements. And then he suggests that anything that doesn't fall into one of these classes is what's called a metaphysical statement. Seems to be making a factual claim about the world that goes beyond what's true by definition, and yet it seems to be describing, not simply evaluating things. It's a very odd category. What about these metaphysical type statements that don't fall into the top three categories? Now, we've gone over all this, haven't we? Who does this look like? You have these three kinds of statements, okay? Synthetic, analytic, and ethical. And then, of course, muddled. Metaphysical statements. What school of philosophy held to that? Somebody said it. Logical positivism, exactly. Okay, and logical positivism gives rise to the verification principle. Something is meaningful only if it is empirically verifiable. And we went through all the tortures of the verification principle and how it's self-defeating. And so then the logical positivists come up with the falsification principle. Something is meaningful only if you can conceive of some way of falsifying it. We went through the difficulties of falsificationism. The fact of the matter is we cannot get away from what are called metaphysical type statements. And the theory of man deals, for the most part, with metaphysical type statements. They are non-verifiable and non-falsifiable in the scientific sense. but they are not meaningless. And you'll notice on page 17 of your reading, the author says as much. He says it's really too much to say that they are meaningless, but we will say they are not scientific. Okay. At that point, you would say, well, now look, Bahnsen, apologist, isn't that good enough? I mean, the guy he's screaming uncle, right? He's not going to push logical positivism. Well, I guess, nothing's ever good enough for us apologists. The only difficulty I have with that is that it suggests that science is somehow in a little bit better epistemic position than those of us who are doing philosophy. Okay, science is a little more objective, a little more tied down to the facts, a little more, if you will, verifiable and falsifiable, and somehow closer to the truth, therefore. Not as arbitrary, ethereal. And my own feeling is that science itself is committed to its own non-verifiable presuppositions, and that science only gets as far as it does get because it's using presuppositions which Christianity alone can supply for it. An ordered world, a good world, a meaningful world, and that sort of thing. But anyway, the author of our book does point out then that the philosophy of man, the theory of human nature, is basically a metaphysical discussion. It's dealing with presuppositions. And on page 7, he points out that if you look at the systems for the philosophy of man, you'll see that there's a similar structure to just about all of the philosophical anthropologies. I'm going to give you my own way of putting this because I think it's easier to remember. He has a fourfold breakdown. He says there's a view of the world, a view of the nature of man, a view of man's problem or diagnosis, and then the prescription for man. That's easy enough to remember. View of the world, nature of man, diagnosis, prescription. The view of the world, I take as the conditioning metaphysical context for the view of man. Technically, there are three breakdowns within the theory of man. There are views of man's dignity, man's dilemma, and man's deliverance. If that alliteration will help you any, as you're reading through, you want to say, now, what, according to Plato, gives man dignity? What is it that makes man man? Okay? Well, what's the dilemma that man has gotten into? And then what kind of deliverance is available for man? Okay, let me give you the Christian translation now of these three categories. Creation, fall, and redemption. Okay? The dignity of man, created as God's image. But his dilemma, he's a fallen man. His deliverance, God's redemption. Okay, creation, fall, and redemption. Now I'm pointing out that these systems of philosophical anthropology have similar structures. The dignity, dilemma, deliverance of man are all matters that are addressed in various philosophical anthropologies because I think there's something reflecting, if you will, the fact that we all know our Maker. We all know the Christian story in our heart of hearts. And so Marx eventually gives what? A counterfeit of a Christian view of creation, fall, and redemption. Freud gives eventually a counterfeit of the Christian view of creation, fall, and redemption. Now, the author doesn't say that, with good reason. He's not committed to that point of view. But I'm suggesting that that similar structure is to be accounted for by the fact that we all know that we're in the image of God, we're fallen creatures, and God's got to provide a way of escape. Yeah.
Seems to me, in looking through this, that aren't they all closed systems?
Yes, didn't I say that at one point? That the author thinks that he distinguishes between closed and open systems of anthropology, and my own conviction is that they all ultimately are closed. That while there are people who may not have made up their mind, and so people aren't closed, the systems themselves are all closed systems.
Yeah, within his writing, the way he's recounted them, it seems to me he presents seven closed systems.
7 closed systems.
Or does he claim that some of these are open?
He claims that some of them are more open to criticism than others. Christianity and Marxism are the epitome of closed systems for him. But I happen to think that he's just doing a little worse on Marxism and Christianity, that all of them are closed systems. When all's said and done, when the chips are down, the ultimate presuppositions are going to be defended. Because if they're not defended, then they're surrendered and the system is changed. Okay, it's time for us to quit. If you want an example of two conflicting systems I was going to go over with you, pages 4, 5, and 6. He has a nice little discussion of how Christianity and Marxism line up. And that's very illustrative of what's going on in philosophical anthropology. While we only have 2 hours left, I think you're going to find the discussion and the reading here somewhat easier than the more logically precise, tough-going, analytical stuff that Brody was giving you. And so that's nice that God gives us a break at the end of our class so you can enjoy the reading. So I'll see you on Wednesday.
Would you care to suggest a bibliographical source for us to investigate that Communicatio Idiomatum on the Lutheran Reformed controversy? What?
Systematic Theology by Hodge.
Hodges.
Sure.
His discussion of it would be adequate to... Does he also bring out that also affects the supper as well as Christology and other things?
As far as I know, yeah. It's been a few years since I've read it, but yeah. Okay, we're studying philosophical anthropology, and I got to the point in my notes, I believe, where having noted the presuppositional character of the questions, the major questions that are raised in philosophical anthropology, we were looking at the similar structure of anthropological theories. That is, each of them tells you something about the nature of man or his dignity. Each speaks of the dilemma or the diagnosis of man's problem. Each speaks of the deliverance or gives a prescription for man so that he might be delivered from his problems. And on pages 4 to 6 of our textbook, there's a quick contrast and comparison of two conflicting systems, Christianity and Marxism. And let's take a look at pages 4 to 6 as we get started today. Stevenson points out that each of these claims, each of these theories, makes claims about the nature of the universe as a whole. He says Christianity is committed to belief in God, and Marx denied, of course, any belief in God, condemned religion as the opium of the people, distracting them from their genuine problems and answers, social problems. And now, as part of their conception of the universe, both of these theories have beliefs about the nature of history. The meaning of history for the Christian is found in its relationship to God, who is eternal. God is working out his purposes through history. And, of course, God's purposes center in the death, the life and death, and we would say resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. Now, Marx, on the other hand, had a philosophy of history, and in it he claimed that there was a pattern of progress to be found in human history, but that progress was not related to anything eternal or transcendent. The progress of history was an internal matter altogether. Marx did believe there would be an inevitable development from one economic stage to another. So feudalism gives way to capitalism, capitalism is going to give way to socialism, socialism to communism. Okay. Now, Christianity and Marxism have different views of God, different views of history. They also have conflicting claims about the essential nature of the human being. The Christian says that man is made in the image of God, and that his destiny depends upon his relationship to God. The value of man is that he survives physical death, and he will face final judgment before God. Marxism, on the other hand, denies that there is any survival after death, and therefore any judgment from God. It must therefore deny the importance of individual moral freedom that Christianity exalts as being a very important feature of human nature. Marx says that our moral ideas and attitudes are really determined by the kind of economic class in which we find ourselves living and the period of society in which we live, the period of history and the kind of society in which we live. Now, given this different view of God, history, and human beings, it's only natural that Christianity and Marxism are going to have different diagnoses of what is wrong with mankind. Okay? The Christian says that what's wrong with man is that he's alienated from God, that he's not living according to God's purposes. that his relationship with God has been disrupted, that he's misused his freedom, that he's rejected God. Marx, on the other hand, replaces the notion of sin with the question, or with the issue or matter of alienation. Man is not matching up to the ideal standard for human life. So what should be done to help man? The Christian, because of his different view of the universe, different view of man, and different view of man's problem, is going to say that he must be made right with God through his Son, Jesus Christ, whereas the Marxist is going to have a completely different answer to the ills of human life. He's going to say we have to transform our society. We have to get to a classless society. We must advance the purposes or the goals of economic revolution. Okay, page 6, our author points out that implicit in these rival prescriptions or deliverance schemes for man are somewhat differing visions of a future in which man is totally regenerated. What is the Christian category that's being brought up here? What do we call this in theology, a vision of the future? An eschatology. There's a Marxist eschatology and there's a Christian eschatology. The Christian vision is of man restored to the state that God intends for him, freely loving and obeying his Maker. The Marxist vision is of a future in this world, a perfect society in which men become their real selves, no longer alienated by economic conditions, but freely active in cooperation with each other. And so you have the Marxist society and you have the New Jerusalem as competing goals or eschatologies for man. So now this is what the book is hoping to achieve, to bring about this type of comparison between Marxism and Christianity, Marxism and Freudianism, Sartrean philosophy and Skinnerian psychology, and what have you. Now the author does not do this for us throughout the book, however. That's what I'm expecting you to do on the final exam. Those 2.5 pages or so are a pretty good model of what I'm looking for when you write up your 3 pages, comparing paragraph by paragraph, if you will, the different elements of each one of these philosophical anthropological systems. Now on pages 122 to 124, Stevenson says there are major disagreements between the presuppositions held by the 7 different systems he inspects. He does allow for some complementary themes. That is, you'll find that these systems don't differ with each other at every single point. They complement each other, they supplement each other, and in many points there's compatibility between the theories. For instance, one might be an existentialist and a Marxist. It's conceivable that you could blend them in some ways. There's compatibility at many points between existentialism and Marxism. But having noted that there are these overlapping areas, similarities, harmonies, and so forth, nevertheless, there are 5 major areas of disagreement. 5 major areas of disagreement between the various theories. The first major question, and the reason I'm doing this comes at the end of the book, and the reason I'm bringing it up now is because as you go through formulating your answers, I think it's good that you know that this is one of the things that's really going to rub, differently on each theory. These questions, I'm going to do them in reverse order from the way the author presents them, because I think the one he puts last is the one that we want to consider the most important. What makes the biggest difference in a person's philosophical anthropology? What is the key determining factor of a person's view of man?
Presuppositional base.
His presupposition as to what? Nature of man, but even more importantly than the nature of man, or if you will, determining the nature of man, the existence of God. That's right. Question of God. Okay, give me a couple of illustrations, maybe more than a couple, from the 7 theories of human nature explored. Give me a few illustrations of theories that do not believe in God. Okay. Okay, Freud did not believe that there was a God. So what does God become? I mean, a lot of people talk about God. What is God according to Freud? What is the idea of God? Is it just a fairy tale? Some story somebody made up and we all made the mistake of believing it?
Father figure left over from childhood.
Exactly, the projection of one's father. Okay, so there, if you will, there is something that takes the place of God as he's not just saying we all have this comic book story told to us about God and we make the mistake of believing it. There's some reason why people are impelled to believe in God. They have this psychological neuroses. They need to believe in God. It's a God figure. Is it essential to Freud that there is no God? Is it essential to Freudianism that there is no God?
Ultimately, yes.
Ultimately, yes. Okay. What is less than ultimate?
Okay, the Freudian might allow the existence of God at the beginning of his discussion, and it would not necessarily appear to be a contradiction of his full framework. But as you look out, you're going to end up with some contradictions if he allows the existence of God.
Let's ask ourselves this: Could a Christian, not a good one or a very self-conscious one, but could a Christian be a Freudian? Is it conceivable that God has so made man that there is a father wish in him? I think it's not only conceivable, I think the Bible teaches that. As a matter of fact, we all do have that inherent need to have a transcendent father. That's right. So Freud says people have this inherent urge to believe in a heavenly father. Does that mean that it's wrong? A lot of people assume that it is. See, we can explain your belief in God. You have the psychoanalytic need. Well, what if the answer to that is, yeah, and that's the way God made me, to need him? So it's conceivable that Freud and a belief in God could be harmonized, although the kind of God and the kind of man Freud talked about, I think, don't come anywhere close to the Christian conception. Now, as a matter of fact, did Freud believe in God? So what is man? If there is no God, what is man? Not the image of God, obviously. Not a creature, yes?
Man himself become God is the highest idea.
Well, man is going to have to do some of the work of God, obviously. He's going to have to create moral standards and that sort of thing. But what is man just in himself for a Freudian? He's an animal. He's an advanced form of animal. And therefore, it only makes sense that there be a comparison between analysis of animal behavior and human behavior, as you find in Lorenz, for instance, or Skinner. Okay, let me ask you this. We've seen in what sense the God and how the God question can be given response by a Freudian. How about for a Sartrean, for an existentialist? For Sartrean existentialism, can there be a God?
Depends on the individual. If you free to choose whether there is a God.
No. I'd like to say yes, but that's just wrong. Sartre says that the key element of existentialism, the beginning point of existentialism, is that there is no God. Because if there were a God, then our essence would be determined in advance. Our essence would have to be what God says it will be. And the key point of existentialism is that man first exists and then he chooses his essence. And since if there were a God, I couldn't choose my essence, it would be predetermined. There can be no God for existentialism. Okay, so you see then how important the question of God is for all of these theories. Christianity, of course, makes the existence of God the key feature of its anthropology. Now notice the following. If you want, I'd give you some help in your apologetic and evangelism. You want to know how you can get into discussing, religious questions with people. It turns out any controversial issue, let's say what we should do about war, or about the economy, or about education, or about sexual relations, or just about anything of interest and discussion among people, is going to depend upon a broader view of one's anthropology. That is, you don't tell animals, to pray for relief of their difficulties or all that. So clearly, what a person thinks of man in society is going to determine what he does about this individual issue. And it turns out, if I'm right in what I'm saying here, that one's view of man is dependent more fundamentally upon his view of God. And so you can see that talking about any particular issue can get you into a discussion of what man is, and of course what man is going to depend upon what your view of God is. And the only reason I'm bringing this out is because I want you to see how easy it is in a university setting or any setting to end up talking about religion. And a lot of people think, they have to make some kind of blunt appeal to the four spiritual laws, or they have to, introduce the theory, out of the blue. But it's the most natural thing in the world to talk about God. God's at the center of every conversation. Because in essence, what you think of God is going to determine what you think of man. It's what you're going to think about what you're talking about. Whether you're talking about the Cleveland Indians or whether you're talking about sexual morality. All is going to depend upon your view of man. But that's not superfluous. If you have Lorenz's view of man, what do you make of the Cleveland Indians? What's happening when people go out and play competitive athletic games?
They have an innate instinct to do that.
That's right. What are we working out? We're working out our animal past. Animals have this sort of, it's a warring type of instinct within them. They work out their hostility. And so that you'll find a male buck, for instance, is going to fight any other male buck that gets on his territory. So the Cleveland Indians are going to see to it that anybody, even if they're called angels, comes in, and they're going to protect their territory. Now, you may not think that's very credible, but given somebody's view of man, when he goes to the ball game, he may, have a beer and a hot dog and enjoy it like you, but he thinks what's going on is people are working out their aggression. In a very civilized way. We have umpires and rules and all the rest and uniforms. We're not going to get bloody over it. But still, that's the background for all of this. Whereas a Christian is going to look upon the Cleveland Indians in a different way. Or any other team. Cleveland Indians may be a poor choice of example here. But what's a Christian going to say about the athletic or if you will, recreational activities of men? They're working out something very deep and essential to their nature and character? No. This is, as a matter of fact, superfluous play. And we have the freedom to do that because we are free human beings. God gives us recreation. Oh, you ever thought about the word recreation? What is the word recreation? Recreation, exactly. Now, I'm not going to get into etymology and but you see, the whole background to recreation comes from the freedom we have because God has recreated us. We can harmonize with each other, we can play games and have fun and have free time and all that. It's part of the goodness of God. But, of course, that isn't the view anymore. Anyway, the question of God is crucial to all these theories. Well, driving from the question of God, or related to how you answer the question of God, is going to be the question of the nature of moral values. The question of God and the question of morality, moral values. First of all, are moral values objective or subjective? Are they objective or subjective? Plato asserted the objectivity of moral values, saying that the form of the good is the objective, trans-temporal, transhuman, trans-relative standard of good and evil. At the very opposite end of things, you have Skinner, who says that there's no basis for values at all. Values are simply what's chosen by the person who's doing the conditioning of another person or thing. There are people who think that the values that are held by people are determined by their society, Marx and Freud in particular. There are those who say we must choose our values completely without guidance, Sartre. So you can see how this whole question of the status of moral values is a critical one in each one of the theories of human nature that you're going to be looking at. I think it's interesting as we go through these questions to start looking at how the various authors or the various philosophers being examined are grouped and how they answer these questions. What basic groups can we get on the question of God? Obviously, Christianity believes in God. Is there any other theory that's being proposed that obviously is the theistic theory? Platonism comes the closest. There is some question as to whether Plato actually believed in the gods or whether he's only using mythological ways of speaking to express his views or to veil the fact that he was really getting away from the theism of his day. But you'd have Christianity, Plato, there'd be some distance there. And then, of course, on the other side, you'd have Freud, Skinner, Sartre, who else are we studying these days? Marx and Lorenz. How about on the nature of moral values? Well, again, you'd have Christianity and Plato holding to the objectivity of moral values. Then you'd have another group that says there's no basis for moral values at all. Skinner, Sartre. He says we have to choose our values. And then there'd be those who say moral values are a reflection of one's society. Freud and Marx. Another major question that is differently answered by each one of these theories is the question of materialism versus dualism. Does man have a mind or a soul, or is man completely a material object? Does man only have a brain? It's what in philosophy is called the mind-body problem. Is man only a body, including a brain, a physical feature of man, part of his body, or is there a mind in man or characterizing man that goes beyond the body or the brain? Is man completely materialistic, or should you have a dualistic view of man that he's made up of two different sorts of things, or there are two different aspects to man? Materialism and dualism. Okay, our author says Plato is definitely a dualist, and I agree. Plato would be over here with those who believe that man is two types of things. He is a body as well as a mind. And Skinner is clearly a materialist. Marx is also a materialist, it turns out. Believes that everything develops from physical forces in man. Is Freud a materialist? Not quite so obvious. He does seem to speak of a psyche. Whether that's subject only to the determinants and factors of the brain, it's another matter altogether. And so we have to put, if you will, Freud on the line. We're not sure what to make of Freud when it comes to dualism or materialism. How about Christianity? Think before you answer. If we did not believe in the intermediate state, I think just about everything in the Bible would lend credence to a materialistic view of man. Materialistic doesn't mean, by the way, atheistic, does it? It just simply means that man is a created being. He's created out of physical stuff of some sort. Of course, we do believe that when the body is dead, there's going to be an aspect of man, sometimes called spirit or soul, that will know communion with God. And so Christianity is dualist in one sense, that it believes that there's a spiritual aspect to man, but whether that spiritual aspect must be interpreted as a substance, a soul in the Platonic sense, is another question altogether. My guess is that will probably come as a surprise to most of you to be told that the Christian view of the soul is not necessarily what Plato was saying. Most Christians have a Platonic view of the soul. The soul is a ghost in a machine. We have the machine of our body, and then we have a little spirit or ghost inside of us, and the ghost goes away at death. and the ghost is restored to the machine, now a much better machine, at the resurrection. Well, while that's easy enough to think about and easy enough to fall into as a conception of man, there's very little evidence that the Bible conceives of man as a ghost in a machine. So, is Christianity monistic or dualistic? The tendency is to put Christianity toward Platonism just because we do believe in an afterlife, okay? But whether we should understand that in the Platonic way is another question altogether. Okay, now we come down to another basic question, the question of determinism versus free will. Oh, I was going to say over here, on materialism and dualism, Sartre is an obvious materialist as well. He doesn't believe there can be anything spiritual, because anything spiritual would operate as an unknown force, threatening the freedom of man to make his own decisions as to his essence and his future, his moral values, and all the rest. Okay, now determinism and free will, you have those who believe that man makes his own choices. And you would have Christianity, believes that man is a morally responsible creature. Who else thinks that man has free will? Sartre. Exactly. Sartre thinks free will is the essence of man, in fact. Now, over against Christianity and Sartreanism, there would be those who think that man is determined by causes outside of himself. An obvious example? Marx. What kind of determinism does Marx believe in? Economic determinism. Skinner would be a determinist as well. What kind of determinist is Skinner? Biological or environmental, actually. What kind of conditioned response is built in from your society is going to determine what you are. How about Freud? Is Freud a determinist? Yes, very definitely he is. What kind of determinism? Psychological determinism. He believes that there are, if you will, deep forces that are, welling up within us like a volcano that are making us do what we do and feel as we feel. Those forces are built into us because of our society and our sexual nature and other things, but nevertheless there are forces that go beyond our own conscious free choices. Now, as we go through this list and make these groupings, it's of some interest to see how the different players end up on different sides of the line. Who is grouped with whom, if you will. Here we have a few where Christianity and Platonism tend to be very similar, which explains, by the way, why throughout history there's been a real urge for Christian philosophers to be Platonist, because there is, if you will, a formal similarity. But now we get down here, Christianity and Sartre stand over against Marx, Skinner, and Freud, whereas Christianity stands over against Sartre and the others up here.
Where does Plato fit in free will?
I'm not sure that we get an answer to that question. I can think of different ways of approaching it. I can't think of any obvious way in which Plato would be a determinist. Plato does think that man is encased in a body. He's a soul encased in a body, trapped in the tomb of the body. And so it may be that our desires and our physical nature have grip of us from time to time, but he also believes that the reasonable man, the equitable man, the just man is one who lets reason dominate his body, and that would tend to support the idea that he has free will. The point I'm trying to make, however, is that we cannot assume that these 5 questions line up the different theories. They don't. There is a mishmash and crisscrossing of the players, and there's a question as to what to make of Freud or of Plato on this one question, and so forth and so on. Sometimes theory gives a very clear answer to one of these questions. Sometimes it gives an ambiguous answer to these questions. Sometimes it finds itself set over against an opponent, and then later on that opponent is on the side of the theory when it comes to further question. So we mustn't think that this very simply sorts everything out. Okay, now the 5th question, finally, that seems to control the various theories and set them apart from each other. It's a question of how innate human nature is over against its possibilities for change. The innateness or controlledness of human nature. How set is human nature over against, if you will, a flexible and changeable conception of human nature? Stevenson says, how much in human nature is innate, how much is learned from the social environment? There are many ways of putting this contrast. This is page 121, by the way. And so let's look at the various ways of putting this contrast. The contrast between the biological and the cultural. There are some people who say human nature is determined by one's biology, and others will say one's culture determines what human nature will be. Now, if it's biological, anything born into the species of human being is going to have the same basic human nature. If human nature is cultural, then of course what you find in the South Sea Islands and what you find in Germany of the 15th century may be completely different human natures, or radically different anyway. Okay, there's a contrast between heredity and environment. How much is determined by our background and genes and all the rest, our heredity? How much is determined by the environment that we presently are experiencing? There's a contrast between nature and nurture, which is a cute way of putting it. That is, there's an essence to man, his nature, but then there's a question of how he's nurtured, how he's brought up. When you watch stories of the wolf boy on TV, you know, the boy who was raised by wolves and so forth, and this, you see, is but a popular way of raising the philosophical question of human nature. Is human nature something innate, or is it something that's a matter of nurture? If a man's brought up by wolves, is he a wolf? Or is he still a human being with wolf characteristics? Question of the contrast between the individual and society. How much depends upon you as a separate individual and what you are? How much is a reflection of the society around you? The contrast can be stated between that of instinctual and conditioned behavior. How much do we do just as a matter of what we are, by instinct? How much is just conditioned in us? There are some people who would say we have no instinct at all, it's only a matter of conditioning. Others would say that conditioning is almost nothing, that we just do what we do by instinct, as other animals. Okay, or a contrast can be stated between that which is universal, inevitable, and unchangeable over against that which is culture relative, subject to change and reform. Okay, and our author says that Plato, Marx, and Skinner emphasize the extent of social conditioning and our power to change individuals by changing social structures and practices. Plato, Marx, and Skinner then have, if you will, malleable theories of human nature. That the society round about you plays a very important role and is a key to determining what kind of person you will be. Christianity, Freud, and Lorenz emphasized the limits to such change created by one's environment or society, and therefore come down hard on the innate universal nature of man, the instinctual, biological, essential nature of man. And now these are the 5 questions then that our author thinks are the most telling, the ones that are not settled by the various theories. These are the theories that are the questions that will set the theories over against each other. These are unresolved issues. It's of interest to me that he thinks this 5th question is an empirical or a scientific question. He thinks the 5th question is something that's to be settled on the basis of evidence. Let's just line up the evidence, let's do our experiments and find out how malleable is human nature. Can we actually create a wolf boy or not? Or is there something, instinctual and essentially human about people? He says the other 4 questions are philosophical in character. No amount of scientific evidence is going to settle the question of determinism of free will, materialism and dualism, the nature of moral values, or the existence of God. Those are all questions of a philosophical order. Are you convinced by that breakdown? It does seem to me that a person's view of the innateness or flexibility of human nature is also a philosophical question. I think what you really have here are varying degrees where empirical or scientific evidence influences the way you answer the question. There's a sense in which empirical evidence will help you determine whether there's a God. Right? We believe that a lot of empirical evidence points to the existence of God. It's also true that the God question is the furthest away from empirical evidence because what you think of God determines how you're going to approach the evidence. And so if he wants to put this on a sliding scale, I tend to think the flexibility or innateness of human nature probably comes the closest to being a scientific question, but I don't believe it is, as a matter of fact, a scientific question. I can imagine people knowing all the same facts and having all the same data before them and nevertheless disagreeing as to the nature of the human being, because they'll explain the data in different ways depending on what they actually think man is.
His differentiation is consistent with his initial discussion of verificationism.
How's that?
Well, he gives a high view of science, and the fact that a theory cannot be verified doesn't mean we throw it out, but it lacks a very important crediting factor.
It's not a scientific theory, that's true. But why is it that he would make this one question scientific and the other is philosophical, do you think?
He obviously is convinced that it is open to scientific inspection and measurement.
Okay, but you see, I can think of reasons why we would think it's not really open or completely determined by scientific evidence. Empirical evidence, and so I'm not quite what I'm saying is, when I read that, I thought, well, that looks a little arbitrary to me, even arbitrary given his previous commitments and values as expressed in the book. Now, if I'm right that these are the 5 essential questions that keep arising as you study these various theories, and if I'm right that these are all essentially philosophical, which is to say philosophical theological questions, how are we going to resolve these differences? How does one, if you will, adjudicate the difference between conflicting philosophical anthropologies? How does a Christian, if you will, deal with a Marxist, a Skinnerian, a Freudian, a Sartrean? How does a Sartrean deal with a Marxist? How do they convince each other? How do they argue with each other? How do they resolve their differences? How does anyone know for sure? What kind of questions are these? These are metaphysical questions, aren't they? Apart from this one here, which is obviously a question about the nature of moral values, and that is very much dependent upon metaphysical issues itself. Here's the question of materialism versus dualism. Has man got a soul or not? Determinism versus free will. Are we part of a causal nexus that completely takes away our freedom or not? Is our human nature flexible, determined by something outside us, or something inherent to us? Does God exist? These are all metaphysical questions. They go beyond the physical. They stand behind the physical. These are philosophical questions. How do you resolve metaphysical questions?
Ask me a question.
Okay, I'd like to continue with this line of thought for a minute.
Along that,
Oh, okay, go ahead then.
do you think the social structures over the years has that affected any of these theories, like wars and
I think the character of one's society does set an attitude and a feeling about people. Sure, there are pessimistic ages and optimistic ages. There are ages that in which people can do very little philosophical reflection. It takes every bit of their strength simply to eke out a living. There are ages that see a great deal of luxury and free time, and therefore there's a lot of philosophical speculation made possible. So I think the character of one's age might be an influential factor in how he approaches the philosophy of man, but I don't believe that the character of one's age determines what he's going to think about man. I think it influences, but I don't think in any set. Because there are people that hold all these different kinds of theories in all different kinds of ages.
So it doesn't, the changes happen even made them to look unto God rather than their own philosophies of life, driving them back to God in that sense. Maybe human philosophies have failed, didn't turn out to be the way they expected, and give them an idea of looking back to God as the answer, or changing their views on God.
Well, there's a sense in which that happens, yes, but it also is the case, and I think it's more usually the case, that one's view of God determines what he makes of the success of his anthropological theory. Okay, let us say that I believe that there is a planet beyond Pluto. Okay, is Pluto the furthest out in our solar system? So I thought. Okay, I think there's another planet in our solar system, one beyond Pluto. Okay, now we haven't observed it with a telescope, but I mean, all the activity of other planetary bodies and their orbits and all that suggests an influence of another planet yet to have been observed. Okay, and now to confirm this theory, I decide to have the United States government build the best telescope that's ever been built. Some huge, monstrous telescope, really has critical abilities and magnitude and all the rest. And so we put the telescope together and we look in the sky where this hypothesized or projected planet is supposed to be, and we don't see it. Now at that point I could say, well, my theory didn't work, I have to go back and reconsider a bunch of other things, as you're suggesting somebody might do. But I may be so committed to the theory that I'd say there's something wrong with the telescope. Or I might say there was if you will, a cloud cover. Or there, if you will, there's some kind of cosmic dust that's interfering with light rays coming from the planet. Or, you know, I could go ahead and ad hoc add on to my theory to salvage, you know, my preconceived notions, my presuppositions. It all depends on how much I have invested in, how much I'm committed to my theory. It's conceivable people living in one kind of age, having one theory of man, would, we would think, be led to see that their theory of man just isn't holding water, just isn't working out, and they should go back and reconsider their view of God. But as a matter of fact, they could go the other direction. They could hold on very desperately to their theory and make modifications in it. They could, you see, say that we know for sure that man is an animal, and therefore if he seems to be acting as a spiritual being, you know, showing that he isn't conditioned completely by his environment, what we need is to study it more. There's always this eschatological cop-out that says, just give us more time, we'll be able to explain this phenomenon too in terms of our theory. So it really goes both ways. But now my question is, how do we resolve metaphysical disputes of the nature that we see on the board? Well, to ask that question is to ask, what epistemology does one have? How does one know anything for sure? What amounts to knowledge? What establishes conditions of evidence and truth? If one's epistemological theory is going to determine how he adjudicates metaphysical conflicts, then the question is going to become, how do we resolve the different epistemological disputes between these theories? You see, Plato says that men know things on the basis of their intuition, because of their acquaintance with the realm of the forms previous to their bodily existence. Men pre-existed as souls, living in familiarity with the forms. Now we come into this world in a body and we have a vague recollection of the realm of the forms. That's why we can do geometry and math, and we can distinguish ducks from cats and all the rest. We know the forms. Marx says that what we know only on the basis of sense experience, only on the basis of generalizations from particular experiences that we know about because of our senses. How are we going to adjudicate these epistemological differences? How do we know what amounts to evidence and truth and knowledge?
What's the Bible say?
Well, I mean, that's one way to do it. We could say, let God answer the question. But of course, if you hold to a theory that doesn't allow for there being a God, then he's not going to want to let God answer the question because he doesn't think there's a God to answer the question. Oh, so apparently we have to answer our epistemological question. We have to know how to know in order to know what amounts to genuine evidence and truth and knowledge, one has got to consider his epistemological theory. I mean, his metaphysical theory. What he thinks of man, the universe, reality, his categories, and all the rest. But that's just the difficulty. These are metaphysical questions that are separating the theorists. To adjudicate the differences on these questions of metaphysics, one has got to appeal to his epistemology, or rest on his epistemology. His epistemology, in turn, rests on what? His metaphysics. Now, the next time somebody gives you a hard time about circular reasoning, just remember the lesson of today's class. I mean, it'd be very nice if we could all say, well, we're not going to reason in a circle, you know, we're not going to be like those presuppositionalists. I mean, if it were possible not to reason in a circle when it comes to these ultimate philosophical questions, we'd all be happy to do it. It isn't so much that some people are preferring circular reasoning or transcendental philosophical reasoning over against scientific straight-line reasoning. It isn't as though you have a choice between presuppositionalism and empirical apologetics. The fact of the matter is we can't avoid circular reasoning. Our epistemological standards are going to be influenced and determined by our metaphysical commitments. And our metaphysical commitments and conflicts are going to be resolved and set down by our epistemological standards. And so again, we're returning here at the end of our course to the beginning of our course, which is somewhat appropriate in light of what I'm telling you. Because at the beginning of the course, I told you that the nature of philosophical disputes is a presuppositional one. How will Freud and Skinner, how will Skinner and Sartre resolve their differences?
Arguing from their presuppositional viewpoint.
They're going to have, but how do you resolve the differences or the conflicts between presuppositions? There's nothing more ultimate to which you can appeal. Thank you. I was just going to say how soon we forget, but that is very encouraging today. It makes my day. We compare the worldviews, the adequacy of the worldviews. Now, as it turns out, at best, Sartre and Skinner are going to have an inter-family dispute. Ironically, all these other 6 theories that you're going to read about in this book have one thing in common, that they're all against Christianity. Okay? And therefore, when Sartre and Skinner argue, there will be a little bit, you know, they can argue back and forth and see inconsistencies in each other. But when all is said and done, it's going to be the Christian worldview set against all these other worldviews as the only one that can do justice to what man is, how he's operating, how he can salvage truth, significance, meaning, and all the rest. If man is not what Christianity says he is, then there are going to be things that we just can't explain. There's going to be irrationality in our philosophy. Now let me put in just a little plug here, although it's not by any means a complete endorsement. But it's just at this point that I think Francis Schaeffer has been found so helpful by many Christians who are studying apologetics. Schaeffer is not a rigorous apologist. He's not a super sophisticated philosopher by any means. But I do believe there's some value in what Schaeffer is doing because he is arguing, without saying so, within the realm of philosophical anthropology. He talks about the mannishness of man and what gives man dignity and freedom and love. Schaeffer is talking about the kinds of issues that are up on the board. And what Schaeffer is pointing to by doing a comparison of worldviews, when he does it correctly, and sometimes he does it in a rationalistic way that I'm sorry to see, but when he is reasoning as a presuppositionalist, Schaeffer is pointing out things such as that the materialistic scientist goes home, from work. And at work, of course, he's living according to his theory, where everything is just physicalistic and a matter of material or scientific or empirical laws. But he goes home and he kisses his wife. You know, he shows that he is committed to a realm of love and value and significance and dignity. Now, if man was only an animal, there'd be no room for love. There'd only simply be physical relations between people. There'd be no questions of justice in our law courts and all the rest. It'd just be a dog-eat-dog world, to use the metaphor. And so even the man who holds to a certain anthropology, such as materialism, betrays his anthropology in another area of his life. He can't, you see, put together a consistent world and life view. That is to say, a view as well as the practice of his life. It just can't be harmonized. And so the value of today's lecture, I hope, is to point out not only what the key questions are as you go through these theories, but the value of today's lecture is to remind you that the only way to resolve the conflicts between these theories is going to be on a presuppositional basis, a comparison of ultimate worldviews, the total view of one's metaphysic, his anthropology, his epistemology, his ethic, and how they harmonize and how they are adequate for the practices and the views of men.
It seems that few of the proponents of these other views are willing to examine their presuppositions.
You say few are willing to do so. Is that your suggestion? I want to make sure I heard you right. If you mean examine in the sense of question, I think you're undoubtedly right. Freud would probably not have wanted to question his conviction that man was an animal, that was conditioned by his sexual and his social nature. That was probably not one of the negotiable parts of Freudianism. There may have been other things, higher level developments in his theory, but that was fundamental to it all. Marx certainly would not question the materialism that's foundational to his view of economic determinism. And as a matter of fact, Christians are not going to question the existence of God. I will question it in the sense that we'll be glad to compare worldviews, but that's because we're convinced in advance that only the Christian worldview will work out. Only the Christian view can give the preconditions of knowledge. You know, what is the Christian view of man? Let's see if we can, in the remaining moments here, outline a Christian view of man to be set over against the other six theories. What is the nature of man, the dignity of man according to Christianity? First three chapters of the Bible tell us not only the nature of man, but also the nature of his problem, if you will, his dilemma. Man is a creature of God. Man is created by God, but he's created as a very special kind of creature. He appears to be the epitome of creation. He is the, if you will, creature that is set over all other creatures in realms of creation. And he has this dignity and function or status in light of the fact that God creates him as his own image. Animals do not image God in his rationality, his morality, his personality, and his dominion. But man does. What man is physically, God is non-physically. Man can see, man can relate, man can reason, man can make moral choices, man can exercise sovereignty. God does all these things without a physical body. And so man is the physical image of God. That isn't to say that he is, in his human body, a reflection of God's body, but man is in a human body what God is without a human body. And that's the dignity of man. He's positively related to God as God's own image, having abilities, a function, a character that is beyond that and unique with respect to the animals. Man has a future. He is immortal. He will always be related to God in some way. Now, it may be in a negative and cursed way, but he will never escape if you will, his relationship, positive or negative, to God. He survives, if you will, eternally. What's the nature of man's dilemma? It's moral, not metaphysical, not, if you will, historical or essential. It isn't as though man has a bad society conditioning him, or that man's made out of bad stuff. Like Plato says, he has a physical body which is dragging him down. The nature of man's problem is moral rather than metaphysical. That is, he has chosen to rebel against God. So there's a moral difficulty in man. And the prescription for man, the deliverance for man, as you know as evangelical Christians, is by God's grace. The perfect man, the God-man, Christ Jesus, dies as the sacrificial substitute. Man is reconciled morally to God, judicially to God, by the death of God's own Son, the perfect man. And therefore man is in his spiritual being regenerated now and understands the promise of a physical regeneration called resurrection in the future. Man will nevertheless die because of the consequences of sin. His body will decay, but he will know the presence of God or absence from the presence of God immediately at the time of his death. And his body will one day be resurrected and will live either in communion with God or in disharmony and separation from God for all eternity. So essentially, the Christian says that man's dignity in nature is that of the image of God. God is brought into the question immediately. The problem with man is a moral problem. He's rebelled against God. The answer is a theological answer, regeneration from God, being recreated as the image of God. And that answer is worked out in two steps, spiritually now, physically later. And so that shows us something about the character of man, too, that there is a physical and a spiritual aspect to his being. You know, as we go through the 6 theories on Friday and look at what each one of them says about the nature, the problem, and the answer, a solution for man, I'd like to take this very brief thumbnail sketch of Christian anthropology and use it as a foil over against each one of the other theories so we can see the uniqueness of the Christian world and life view when it comes to philosophical anthropology. Rather than jumping into that right now, we're only a few minutes from when we should stop, and I think we'll stop here after I give you a chance for questions. Any questions on today's lesson or last time?
We continue to talk about Christianity as a monolithic belief.
Yes.
When you do, are you referring to it that if we followed it as it was written, it would be monolithic? But we don't.
What I will take as Christianity is biblical Christianity. That is, Christianity is defined by the Bible. Now, immediately you're going to say, but people interpret the Bible differently. I grant that, but I do not grant that the Bible is a wax nose to be formed in any shape or direction as you want it to be formed. While we have, because of sin, the difficulty of disagreements and obscurities and confusions in the and mistakes in the confusion of the Bible, I do believe, it's a presupposition of Christian theology, that the Bible has one message, not many messages. You recall how Paul says when he writes to the church, our letter to you was not yea and nay. Paul says, we didn't write some kind of dialectical theology to you where you can take it this way or take it that. Paul says, I have a very definite message for you. And there is a definite message in the Bible, although Christians, because of the remaining sin in them, are going to differ over as to what that is. For the most part in this class, I've tried to hold to a pretty, if you will, center-of-the-road evangelical approach to Christian theology. Most of what I'll be saying about anthropology, just about any evangelical Christian, I think, would grant. We've had points, obviously, when it comes to free will and determinism, where some differences among evangelicals have played a part. But that's inevitable. I mean, since I don't believe the Bible equivocates, I have to think the Bible teaches one way and not the other. And at those points, my own theological convictions have been determinative in the lectures. And with anthropology, the same will be true. It's just I don't see a whole lot of room for controversy over, for instance, my view of anthropology is just outlined. Most evangelicals would say that. Most neo-Orthodox would not. Okay, so I mean, there's always going to be a question of, you know, the circle within which you are operating as a scholar, and I'm operating within the evangelical orbit. Other questions?
The fifth problem of the innateness versus flexible. I agree with the way you put it up there. However, our sin nature is exchanged. We are changed. How does that fit in? It seems that that's being defined in a way that we have an essential nature rather than a changing nature.
Well, what changes, of course, is our spiritual relationship to God. It doesn't seem to me that our human nature changes. Okay? Now, little insight. This is the traditional Reformed view of the image of God. There is an image of God in the narrow sense and in the broad sense. Okay? In the broad sense, everybody is God's image, even unbelievers, because they are distinct from the animals and they maintain their human dignity as a special creation set apart for a special task by God, having immortality, the ability to reason, make moral decisions, and so forth. Okay? But in the narrow sense of the image of God, actually imaging God morally or spiritually, doing what you're supposed to do, not all of us are. If you will, it's kind of like a car. Cars going different directions on the interstate are both cars, although they're going different directions. Now, if it so happens that cars have been made to go one direction, and only one direction, then those that are going the opposite are rebellious cars. But they're rebellious cars and not non-cars. And so I'm maintaining that there is an essential human nature, and it will be essentially human even in hell. But there are some people who are, even though they are not non-human, are acting in an anti-human way. They're acting contrary to their human nature in the narrow sense of what God created them to be. So I should say what changes is essentially the moral aspect of man and not the metaphysical aspect of man. Redemption, the fall and redemption are not metaphysical matters. Even unbelievers will be resurrected, but to the resurrection of damnation. They will suffer in their physical bodies for all eternity. And so that is a crucial point in Reformed theology, by the way, that the fall and redemption are not metaphysical. Now, they are in Roman Catholic theology. And I tend to think they are in Arminian theology to some degree as well. But Reformed theology has consistently stressed that the fall of man is moral in character and therefore his redemption. I'd like to do some comparison of 6 theories of human nature, which, although are not exhaustive of all of the non-Christian options, seem to me to come very close to combining the main lines of non-Christian philosophical thought on the theory of man. I was suggesting earlier today to Tom Schiffler that in a real sense, what is surveyed in our book, those 6 theories of human nature, are the main strains of anthropological opinion advanced in our culture and colleges today, either in themselves or in some form of combination. Platonism, Marxism, Freudianism, Sartreanism, Skinnerianism, and Lorenz, who is probably unknown to many of us American thinkers. But anyway, these 6 approaches to man embody, as I recall my undergraduate education, the main thought of unbelievers about man himself. And so I'd like to go through the theories of these 6 men with respect to basic philosophical approach to the universe, the nature of man, the diagnosis of man's problem, and the prescription for man's deliverance that they offer. And you're saying, well, that's a very nice thing to do in the last day of class, because you may recall there is a question like that on your final exam. I'm going to be doing it probably briefer than you're going to do on the final exam, but nevertheless this will give you some outline of what I'm looking for. Let's begin with Plato. And I suppose the most important thing to say about Plato's metaphysics is that he believes in a realm of timeless forms. I think one of the easiest ways to explain the theory of forms in our day is to think of forms as the formulas for things. When Euthyphro comes to make accusation against his father in the court in Athens, Socrates encounters him. He says, "You must have a very good idea of what piety is and what justice is if you can bring accusation against your own father." Euthyphro says, "Yes, I have a very exact notion of what these things are." And so Socrates says, "Well, then what is justice? What is piety?" And every time he proposes a definition or something, then Socrates, picks it apart. And Socrates is looking for that one essential element or definition that makes justice or piety what it is. A timeless formula that covers all the diverse instances. Now, we have a lot of different instances of justice, don't we? Okay, this particular court case is an instance of justice. Another court case, say in New York, and another day is an instance of justice. The way you treat this particular person in your neighborhood is an instance of justice. You have all these different instances of justice, point by point by point. But what is it that they have in common? What is the one essential universal feature of all these particular instances? And that will be a timeless formula. Timeless because it's not set at some particular time or location. This is what all instances in time have in common. So this is the formula, the timeless formula for justice. Now, if the form is timeless, if the idea or essence or formula for something is timeless, then it is not known in any empirical way. Because the only things we know in empirical fashion are things tied to spatial location and temporal location. Okay, so that I know that there's a tape recorder on the chair in front of me, because at this particular time, using these particular eyes, I can have a sensation from that particular object at that particular point in space. But if the form of tape recorderness, if the formula for something being a tape recorder is to be known, it can't be known by just looking at this tape recorder and that tape recorder and this tape recorder and that tape recorder. Because in looking at these empirical objects, you only know a particular thing. But I don't want to know a particular, I want to know a universal. I want to know the essence of tape recorderness. And so Plato, in his theory of knowledge, was anti-empirical. He had a rationalistic theory of knowledge. People know things by intuition. People know the forms because in a previous existence they had familiarity with the forms. Now, if there is such a realm of timeless forms that are not known through the senses, but are known rationally and intuitively, then among those forms must be numbered the most important, the objective form of the good. Objective goodness, therefore, exists for Plato. There is a universal standard of justice, a universal standard of value. Values don't vary from culture to culture. It isn't as though what's wrong in America is right in the South Sea Islands. There is a timeless form of the good. And cultures which do not approximate the good, do not reflect the good, are not, if you will, participating in the form of the good, are not good cultures. Okay, so this is basically Plato's philosophical outlook. As you can see, at every point, Plato is speaking in an anti-skeptical fashion. Plato lived in a day where the sophists had taught that man is the measure of all things, that everything is relative, that what's good is good for you, what's right is right for you, what's true is true for you. And so everything is tied down to the particular man in a particular culture at a particular time. Plato said, no, the forms of things are timeless. They are not known by looking at particular cultures, men, or experiences, and they are objective. It makes no difference what you think about it. The good exists in and of itself. So he was anti-skeptical. He's against the idea that we couldn't know these things. Okay, what is Plato's theory of man? Plato basically thought of man as dualistic. Man is made up of a material body and an immaterial soul, or immortal soul. The soul of man, it turns out, is tripartite. Next time you read that in a Christian theology book, you might want to ask how much comes from Plato and how much comes from biblical exegesis. Plato taught that man's soul is really made up of three different types of things. First of all, reason. Man's ability to think things through according to intuition and logic, the reasoning part of man. And then there's the desire part of man, if you will, part of his material nature. Men are hungry, men desire sexual relations, men have various, if you will, physical desires. And then the third part of the soul of man is variously called emotion or spirit or anger, whatever it is that, if you will, motivates man. And so you have, let's say, a man is, in terms of his desires, let's say he's hungry for a double hot fudge sundae, okay? But his reason says, now if I have another hot fudge sundae, which is going to be the third I've had today, then I'm going to get a little bit overweight, and that's not good for me. So the reason says, no more hot fudge sundaes today. The desire says, I'm hungry for hot fudge sundaes. And very likely, if the person is not philosophically inclined, his spirit, you see, his emotion is going to determine what he actually does there. It's going to be the deciding factor. Usually, Plato says, usually the spirit sides with the reason. Isn't that true? You've noticed people, when they get really emotional and make up their minds on the basis of emotion, they usually do the most reasonable thing, don't they? This is the point where a lot of philosophers reading Plato say they're not sure that he was really watching human beings when he formulated this theory. Because, as a matter of fact, emotion tends to go with desire rather than with reason, or so it seems to me. Yeah.
Which one of these would we call the will?
The will is actually determined by all three together.
As far as Plato.
Yeah, according to Plato. That's what I'm trying to answer. That what you will to do is determined by the combination of your desire, reason, and spirit. Okay, now what is justice for Plato? Diaxune, righteousness in the New Testament, a Greek word for righteousness or justice. Plato says justice is a harmony of these three elements of the soul. You have the three parts of the soul, and when they're all working together, each doing its proper function, when they're all balanced with each other in the proper proportions, then you have a harmonious spirit, a just man. The last thing to be said about Plato's theory of man is that he saw man as a social creature, dependent essentially upon his social relations, and especially the division of labor. No man can supply all of his needs. And so you've got to learn in society to harmoniously get along with those who supply flour, those who supply military protection, those that supply medical benefits, what have you. You need to learn the division of labor so that you can harmoniously relate to men in your society. Okay, there you see is the nature of man. What's man's problem according to Plato? What's man's problem? Well, it's disharmony. Men get into difficulty when there's not a balance in the three parts of their soul. Now, things really get out of hand, really out of control, when reason is no longer the charioteer, as Plato says. Reason is supposed to be the one who is driving the chariot. And you have appetite, desire, and spirit, you know, as the two horses of the chariot. And what happens, though, you see, when the charioteer gets thrown down on the ground, one of the horses is in the chariot. Then things are going wacko. You know, you can't have man operating properly if he doesn't let reason dominate. Okay, so the problem for men is that they're not letting reason lead them. They're not letting reason take control of their appetites and their desires and their spirit, or their spiritedness. Injustice, then, is disharmony. Now, what's injustice in society by reflection or analogy? Injustice in society is a state of disharmony among men. Not within the soul of man, but from man to man. Now, every particular man has a particular emphasis that he can add to society. While all men should let reason dominate, there are some men who are better at doing reasonable things, and other men are better at doing appetite or desired type things, and some men are more spirited. Some men are more emotional. Okay? And so there are three basic types of men, too. There are, if you will, the intellectuals. Plato calls them the philosophers. There are those who take care of, if you will, the administrative needs of people, the soldiers, the police, the civil servants, and then there's another class of men, Plato usually calls them the farmers and merchants. Okay, those who make, if you will, a middle-class living. Now, in a society, you're going to have to bring some harmony to, if you will, the soldier class, the philosopher class, and the working class. And what kind of harmony is a just society going to see? The same kind of harmony that you expect in the soul. And what is the harmony in the soul? It's when reason is leading. And so in society, who should be the kings? The philosophers. Now you all have to admit, as a result of this class, you're probably all very much inclined toward that view. Right? You've seen in reading these philosophers, this is just the sort of person you'd want to lead you, right? Yes, it does seem a little implausible. There is, if you will, a prima facie absurdity to this, but of course in terms of Plato's philosophy it all fits, doesn't it? This is exactly the appropriate thing to say. If reason is what brings justice and balance within the soul of man, then the reasonable men, the intellectuals, ought to be the leaders. Okay, now just to show you that we don't lose any of the elements of this ancient philosophy, we just get it repackaged from time to time. This week, one of the wives of a presidential hopeful candidate happened to say to a civic club that she was better qualified to be the first lady than somebody else who happens to be the first lady. And why was she better qualified? Because she has a master's degree and the first lady does not. Now, I'm not going to make a big deal of that in terms of presidential politics, but again, that is, if you will, a resurrection of this old Platonic idea that the intellectuals are the natural leaders. What happens when you have a society where the soldiers lead? Obviously, you're going to get a despotic society, a tyrannical society, a bloodthirsty society. What happens when the merchants lead? Then the poor get pushed down and nobody gets taken care of. It's a selfish society. It turns into an elitist society. And so the best society is going to be a society run by the intellectuals.
But I bet she doesn't know anything about indexical reference, right?
That's, well, you know, there are people who are educated and then there are people who are super educated. And if we get one of the candidates' wives say that she knows something about indexical reference, then I say you better vote for her. That's right, because she knows a lot more than we do, obviously. See, the nature of the problem, what's the solution then to man's difficulties for Plato? This is Jerry Brown. Now. Linda Ronstadt's had nothing to do with this. Okay, what's the solution to man's problems for Plato then? The philosopher king. I want you all to remember this in case I ever run for president someday. Secondly, education is the key. If you want to make people do what is right, then you must educate them as to what is right. Now that is perhaps the, if you will, the most enduring influence of Platonic philosophy on our social structure today. Because we continue to believe that if we'll educate people in what is right, that they will do the right. If you will, education is a regenerative force in our society, or so it is thought. It is thought that if we just get people enough education, we'll have a safer and a saner society. Do the facts bear that out? There was no public school prior to the 1830s in this country. Was it a safer, more moral, considerate, and all the rest society before the 1830s? I think there's very few people that can deny that it was. It was a much, if you will, much more moral society. Education has not brought about the reform of man. Finally, Plato believed in a strict threefold class division. There are some people who are naturally suited to lead, some people naturally suited to follow out orders, the soldier class, and there are some people naturally suited to be merchants. So in the Platonic approach to man, I'm going to take far too long if I don't speed this up here. I want to point out some difficulties. You notice that his anti-skeptical thrust all depends upon his metaphysical theory of the forms. Where are the forms to be found? Nowhere. Has anybody ever seen a form? No. The nature of the case, they can't be seen. They're anti-empirical. How do we know the forms aren't just apple pie in the sky by and by? Aristotle, the greatest student of Plato, got rid of Plato's timeless forms. He said whatever forms there are always embodied. There are no disembodied forms. There is no, if you will, form of triangularity in the heavens somewhere. Triangularity is found, to the degree that it is found, only in existent particular empirical triangles. Well, if we have difficulty with the forms, and I think we will, are there then objective universal values after all? Well, even if you grant that there are objective and universal values, and if we are to follow those men who know the forms better than anybody else, because they're the intellectuals, they're the philosophers, how are we going to go about settling disagreements between rational men? You see, Plato's theory would be all well and good if it turned out that everybody who studied philosophy agreed. But have you been convinced by reading the textbook this term that philosophers, one of the predominant traits of the class of men called philosophers is agreement? No, of all men, they are the most disagreeable, not only because they're so arrogant sometimes, but because they just tend not to agree with each other. So how do you settle these disputes between rational men? Moreover, has history or your personal experience borne out the idea that knowledge leads to virtue? That if you make a man knowledgeable, you'll make him more virtuous? No, so there's another unrealistic feature of Plato's philosophy. Notice that in Plato's ideal society, rulers, the philosophical rulers, would have absolute power over the opinions that are expressed in society, what people think, and how children are educated. You have to stop and think about the tyrannical implications of that. Are you satisfied that no philosopher would ever abuse that kind of ultimate power over the thoughts of other individuals? Well, I'm not. We could ask also about Plato's theory of man, this dualism. Is it true that there is an immaterial substance within man? That man is a material being with an immaterial ghost within him? Well, if it's true, and I have some real questions about that, if it's true, how can an immaterial thing be broken up into three parts? I know how to cut a pie into three parts. I know how to divide this room into three parts. You can divide all sorts of material things into parts, but how do you divide immaterial things into parts? The only way you can think of dividing immaterial things into parts is to pretend that immaterial things are material. And so Plato seems not to be able to make up his mind about the nature of the soul. By the way, why are there only three divisions in the soul? I mean, you can think of other ways of cutting the cake, if you will. Why can't we say there are 16 features to the soul rather than 3? You can divide up men into their various proclivities and powers and all the rest in various ways. So there seems to be some arbitrariness here.
Does he ever try to answer that interesting question?
No. No, it doesn't.
Plato
seems to be tied to this macrocosm-microcosm analogy. And so, since he thought of men as falling into three kinds, the intellectuals, the followers, soldiers, and then the merchants, he tended to think the soul would have three parts too.
Which came first?
Well, chicken or the egg questions would not bother Plato too much. The important thing is that justice for man is harmony within the soul, justice for society is harmony within the society, whichever historically comes first.
So for him, neither one. I mean, speaking of...
They come together, actually. We're not going to get justice in society until the disharmony within men is taken care of. Okay, well, let's move on. I have other criticisms I could make of Plato, but by contrast, let's see what Marx does with these questions. Let me cut short my exposition here a bit. Marx was a determinist, of course. He believed that men were made up of material bodies, and that's all, and that what happens in terms of the relations between men who are nothing more but matter, sophisticated matter, was determined by laws of historical development characterized by economic relations. If you will, he was an economic determinist. Economic conditions determine what happens in history and society. Now, Marx did believe that society was moving in a particular direction. What direction? Moving toward the stateless society, a society without the state. Now, to get there, we're going to have to go through various stages. We're living, at least Marx thought in his day, in the stage known as capitalism. But capitalism would give way to socialism to communism through the dictatorship of the proletariat as one of the steps along the way, and then finally men would abolish the state and we would reach utopia. Now, Marx had an interesting way of getting there. To decentralize the state, Marx believed in doing what? Centralizing the state. That's one of the contradictions in Marxism, that it's going to be resolved. I'll have to leave you to resolve it because I can't see how it can be. According to Marx, man was essentially social in nature. He has no afterlife. Man is basically a social creature determined by his economic conditions. Man is distinctively a productive being as well. Man is, among all the animals, remember he is just another animal like anything else. He has no soul or no spiritual aspect. But man is productive. He is an economic creature determined by his social conditions, his economic social conditions. What is the problem in man? Alienation. The worker is alienated from the means of production. He is alienated from his true nature because he has to work for somebody else, and therefore his time is not his own. The product of his labor is not his own. The way it's priced is not his own, and consequently he hates his life. He doesn't care for the product of his labor. He doesn't care about his time. He is really a slave. And so this alienation from his true nature is the basic problem in man. Work is not part of the worker's nature anymore. He is alienated from his work. And Marx suggests many causes for this alienation. Private property, the fact that there's no community feeling among people, the fact that people are being used merely as a means to an end rather than being seen as valuable in themselves. And so how are we, if man is basically a social and productive animal who is alienated from his work, the answer for man's problems is going to be an economic revolution. The workers must arise and take over. They must change their economic environment, because if man is conditioned by his social environment, the only way to regenerate man is to change his environment. And what in particular do we have to do in the revolution? We must abolish private property and move to a stateless society. Okay? We're going to get to a stateless society by emphasizing the state along the way, however, remember. We're going to give ultimate power to the state so that eventually the state can abolish itself. Freud.
Dr. Dawson?
Yes, sir.
Before you get to Freud, I'd just like to make the observation that puzzled me for many years until I figured it out. Why is communism, especially Chinese communism, so anti-family? Why do they divide the children from the parents and so forth? And because there's nothing inherent in communism that would demand that. In fact, communism would accentuate the family. And then I realized, if the biggest sin is private property, and private property in the sense of domain comes from the clan, and from the family, we, daddy, mommy, kids, own something, inheritance, that if I can get rid of the family, then private property would vanish.
You're exactly right. Private property and the family go hand in hand in Marx. The only way to break the hold of the family and therefore private property is to have the state do the education and raising of the children.
But I don't know of a Marxist who considers family intrinsically evil. It's private property that's intrinsically evil. So they just say, in compassion, they say, well, I'm sorry, but the family has to go. In other words, they see the dispensing of the family as an act of mercy to where one wants to get.
I don't know how many Marxists you've talked to. It may be true that the ones you've run into have not felt that way, but Marxist philosophy says family is inherently evil. Because the family essentially breaks up society into units that consider themselves owners of particular property, inheritance as you mentioned it. The idea that the parents own the children, can control the children rather than the state, is essentially the claim that the state doesn't have this ultimate power that it must have in terms of Marxist dialectic of history, so that eventually there'll be no state at all. We all have to become one large family, to put it another way. And as long as we perpetuate individual families, we'll never have this communal society that we're looking for.
So more precisely, the sin is not ownership of private property, but ownership, lordship.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The ultimate sin is private property, ownership.
Ownership. Ownership in the broader sense, like me owning my kids.